and welcome to Dr. David Kilcullen, author of Dragons and Snakes, plus many other titles surrounding the subjects of counterinsurgency, irregular warfare, and guerrilla warfare. Welcome to the National Security Space Institute, the NSSI, here in Colorado Springs at Peterson Space Force Base. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks, Fran. It was great to be here.
Wonderful. So I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you. Obviously, the book that is most applicable to the topics that we're going to talk about today is Dragons and Snakes, but I think having that conversation around how space influences special operations, considering the impacts, opportunities, risks and vulnerabilities with irregular warfare, and how, when we're looking forward to the future and potential conflicts that are about to unfold, how space can be capitalized on or manipulated to cause us disadvantage.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way to start the conversation. I mean, we've been dealing with, let's call it 1993 as the start date, right? So that's the year both of the GPS constellation, the Global Positioning System, US government space program, US military space program that creates GNSS as we know it today. And people use GPS as a shorthand for a whole variety of systems because of that. And 1993 is also the first mobile phone. So we're talking about 31 years ago. And for an entire generation, the West, the US, has been the dominant player in space and hasn't had to worry about a contested space environment or a contested GNSS environment or a contested SATCOM environment. You know, we've been able to say, well, you know, we provide a global public service, therefore we don't expect adversaries are going to disrupt that. From about 2007 onward, but I would say accelerating dramatically in the last 10 years, we now are starting to recognize that space is an actual warfighting domain, right? In which we're dealing with empowered state actors that increasingly have the ability to disrupt not only the military applications of space, but all the civilian things that hang off of that military platform. And I think that's a really significant development that a lot of people fully haven't caught up to yet. And then the other development, and the reason I mentioned the mobile phone, is that with the rise of smart handheld systems, really beginning with the smartphone in around 2006, 2007, we now have capabilities in the hands of non-state actors, both good actors and bad actors, that give them capabilities that rival what you used to have to be a nation state to acquire. And I think that's a new environment for people that grew up in a situation where basically Western dominance of the global commons of space was something that people more or less took for granted. I think that's no longer the case.
It never really featured in that cognitive space when we considered warfare and how we were going to fight, that space and more digital capabilities would be contested in the way they are now or used against us.
Yeah.
I think it would be really good just to check. I'd love to understand what your definition is of irregular warfare. Previously, it's been described as the fight for legitimacy between state and non-state actors. Is that still valid?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that irregular warfare as an idea was well understood in the special operations and intelligence community until about the mid-2000s. And then from about 2005 onward, it became more of a mainstream concept. And it was until very recently what you just described. So the notion of a contest between state and non-state actors where there's an audience, right? A global audience, but also maybe a local audience. And what you're competing for is legitimacy in the eyes of that audience. About 18 months ago, the US government changed their definition to basically the application of a tailored mix of different types of coercive, persuasive, and other power to achieve a warfighting goal, where it may be a standalone, it may be an adjunct to conventional warfare, or you might see conventional warfare supporting an irregular warfare approach. That's not the definition. This is me paraphrasing, a 30-page document. I would say that any time you're engaged in warfighting in which there's a non-state armed group playing a really major role, you're probably looking at irregular warfare. And typically we have a number of submissions there, things like counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, foreign internal defense, stabilization, unconventional warfare. All those things are sort of subcomponents of the general discipline of irregular warfare. But that's a very pre-space, pre-SATCOM, cell phone way of thinking about it. NATO, I think, it gets it right when they talk about warfare increasingly being unbounded, right? So combat action not constrained by space and time, right? And persistent. So these forever wars that people talk about, partly because drivers of Western civilization pushing us into conflicts repeatedly, but also because it's just very difficult to end these wars, right? So boundless, persistent, and if you like, ambiguous, kind of vague. Are we in a war? Are we not? If we're in a war, has it already started, or are we still playing catch up? And we're starting to see the emergence of like the cognitive domain as a really important part of how those kinds of wars are fought for both state actors and non-state actors, which is back to the irregular warfare.
And with non-state actors, we make the assumption that they're not going to have the same kind of budgets that state actors will. And we have these huge sort of digital technological advances in state actor capability. So with non-state actors, without the same kind of bounds and constraints that we would have as a nation, and adherences to what we would call proper or correct, or the way to do things, like aligning with the Geneva Convention, for example. How do we anticipate that non-state actors will capitalize on capabilities that are driven or in the space domain, when although they have these different freedoms and flexibilities, they may not have the same budgets as the likes of the US?
Yeah. So without giving any particular detail away, I think I would just say that things like, for example, military space satellite imagery is a lot less secure and a lot less hard to obtain for an unauthorized actor than you might think, given the kinds of tools that are available now to people. I think you can also say that the ability to jam locally GPS or to disrupt or spoof signals. Some people may be familiar with the Erebus disaster, where an Air New Zealand aircraft full of passengers flew into a mountain in Antarctica and killed everybody on board in the 1970s. And that was basically a 10 nautical mile navigation error, caused that entire fiasco, disaster. That's relatively easy now to generate with a handheld device for a non-state actor. So I think we're getting to the point where your ability to use our dependence on space to inflict damage on our Western-style power is increasingly something that's in the hands of adversary non-state actors. But then the other thing, which I think is actually our biggest weakness, is because we are so dependent on GPS, satellite communications, a variety of other space-based systems, it's extraordinarily unlikely that a Western government will voluntarily turn those systems off. So a non-state actor can rely on the fact that, the Americans aren't going to shut off GPS because they need GPS for everything they're trying to do. So that means I can craft my system around the expectation of I have permanent access to GPS. I think that's probably no longer a good assumption for the US since about 2020, when China launched the final satellite in their Beidou constellation. So you now have a state actor who, for the first time in history, has a capability roughly equivalent to GPS, not quite to the same level of precision and global coverage, but getting there and getting there quickly, So I think we're going to be pretty soon in a situation where non-state actors can sort of forum shop between different systems of competing state actors as a way of staying ahead of the disruption.
Do you think, when it comes to the likes of GPS, that's such an accessible system, and it's not just for our military users, it has a huge civilian implication. How do we balance mitigating this access to people who we don't necessarily want to use this system for their advantage and their benefit and against us? How do you balance the mitigation of allowing them access versus tolerating their access and being able to counter it so that we can still use it with the same flexibility and freedom that we do today?
Yeah. So some of the older people listening will probably remember that until about the year 2000, there used to be an error signal built into GPS specifically to differentiate military users from the general civilian user. That error was taken out at the beginning of the century. And now a lot of the systems that people rely on, just mapping devices and the ability to use your automatic payment systems are highly dependent on a really, really accurate timing signal that comes, and a lot of like urban infrastructure, for example, doesn't work without that. But of course, it's a policy choice on the part of the people that run GPS to not have that error in there. In the 1990s, we used to do a lot of work on so-called differential GPS, having different receivers and zeroing out the error signal as ways of generating high precision GPS for civilian use. I'm not sure that's actually going to be needed anymore, but that's the kind of thing where a number of things that were bread and butter in the 1990s may need to come back. So for an aviator, things like LORAN or LORAN-B, which is still around as a system, but may not have been particularly front of mind for the last 20 years. Well, that stuff might need to come back as it was in the 1990s. Things like Celestial Nav, are increasingly being retrained in navies and air forces. People are getting up in the Astrodome and doing cell shots while doing long overwater flights like, my grandfather did in World War II, precisely because you may not be able to rely anymore on, what we've sort of come to take for granted. Another example would be the re-emergence of things like troposcatter and HF carrier wave and a whole variety of different long-range communication systems to offset the possibility that some actor might just be ready to, whether a state or a non-state actor, be ready to either knock your system out or attack your confidence in the system, right? So there's that cognitive warfare maneuver.
Seed of doubt.
Yeah, right.
So there's the ability to access capability, buy it, use it, obtain it, stop it. How, I suppose my question is maybe in two parts. How competent are the non-state actors who are acquiring or interfering with these different systems? Like for example, with EO imagery, we have a huge investment into our intelligence personnel to understand exactly what can be learned from a specific image. How competent are non-state actors in actually utilizing and exploiting space capabilities compared to us? Like, is that something they're focusing on, or is it sort of taken for granted that a picture is a picture? And the second part is probably because I'm sat in a schoolhouse where we like to talk about generating and maintaining advantage through space means. How can we, as the West, if you like, principally the US, considering where we are right now, shape and better educate our personnel to avoid falling into pitfalls and traps that are presented by our adversaries going forward?
Yeah, those are both really interesting questions. On the first one, it depends what you mean by non-state actor, right? So if you're talking about, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in northern Syria, or you're talking about the Myanmar Democracy Front fighting in Myanmar, you're going to get a variety of different skill sets. But, Bellingcat is a non-state actor. Maxar Technologies is a non-state actor. There are lots of players who are non-state, but we would regard as friendly or legitimate, and they're not engaging in warfare right now, right? But are playing a role actually in shaping the strategic environment that are highly competent, and arguably more competent than some developing world or even first world, military intelligence assets. The other thing is that increasingly, as we use things like multispectral command and control systems on UAVs, every time you lose one of those, or even every time you use it successfully, you're essentially handing over a software-defined radio setup to your adversary and having to redesign that on the fly continuously. And if you're playing in that space as a non-state actor, you're in a graduate school of military innovation. And so again, we're seeing rapid development around a whole variety of different things, but this one as well. So I think historically, let's say bad non-state actor groups, so non-state armed groups that oppose governments, have not been as capable as the governments that they oppose. But look at the stuff that, for example, Hamas did on the 7th of October last year. Multi-domain attack at 16 different sites simultaneously, capturing key events on video, immediately getting that out to a global audience. Significant use of GPS, Google Earth for planning, understanding of adversary movement patterns through location intelligence, a whole variety of things, right? So you're talking about a hyper-empowered, multi-domain non-state actor.
Yeah.
Another example, right now, I'm not going to go quite so far as to say that Western navies have been defeated at sea by the Houthis, but the purpose of our operations in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb has been to protect civilian commercial shipping going through that area that's being disrupted by, again, a multi-domain, hyper-empowered non-state actor in the form of the Ansar Allah, the Houthis. And we're failing, right? I mean, there's been a huge offset of global shipping traffic away from that area around Africa, adding many days and many dollars to that cost, right? And yes, warships aren't getting sunk, but if your point of being there is to protect an asset and you're not able to protect it, then you're not achieving your mission. So I think, you can take that idea too far, because I don't think it's quite as bad as that. But we're on a trajectory where a saturation attack from a hyper-empowered non-state actor, if I have defensive weapons and the adversary launches a swarm of N+1 missiles at me, I'm gone, right? Yeah. And at some point, we're going to have to make the decision of whether we're actually capable of being that close in shore, or being in that airspace. And then you have the interplay of non-state actors shaping the way that we operate, allowing a state adversary to operate as well. So you get this sort of hyper-empowered collaboration like we see with Hamas and Ansar Allah with Iran, generating an outcome that's more than the sum of its parts. Yeah. So yeah, I think they're very capable. I don't think we fully grasped how quickly they're evolving. Then to your last point, how do we train our people? I do think there's a lot of work being done now on getting people back to the dead reckoning pencil on a map, analog ways of thinking, not because we are losing confidence necessarily in our current systems, but to create optionality, right? So that if we, for whatever reason, decided that we needed to turn those systems off or temporarily disrupt them or put the error back in the GPS or whatever it is, that we wouldn't then suffer the massive disruption that we currently would. I think we need to train our people better on that stuff. And we also need to educate the public on just how much of modern industrial life is now dependent on space platforms. Like, you don't think when you're, using Google Maps or fueling your car or buying something at a supermarket, but actually it's a US military space system, GPS, that's enabling 90% of that stuff, right? Going through traffic lights in a rush hour scenario. Again, space systems go out, all of that modern functionality disappears. And I don't think a lot of people who've grown up in the last 30 years have that.
The opportunities for disruption are excessive and unconsidered in modern mindsets.
Yeah. And particularly with the Internet of Things now, we're getting to the environment where you can have a lethal effect on somebody else with just a cyber attack, right? And vice versa. You can use a lethal physical maneuver to disrupt somebody else's data. And we're starting to see the emergence of what my team calls cyber kinetic operations, right? Cyber operations designed for a kinetic impact, kinetic or maneuver operations designed for a data impact, and this sort of seamless integration. We've seen a lot of this in Ukraine. And I think it also, of course, in Gaza. So I think we're going to see that proliferate as a technique, just as the dependence on Internet of Things becomes increasing.
So when I think of asymmetric warfare, like the example that comes to my mind is the Soviet-Afghan conflict and the Soviet-Afghan war, that took place in the 70s, and the introduction of the SAM, the surface-to-air missile on the Hind helicopter. So we have a very small sort of mobile but probably ill-equipped and maybe less well-trained force or group organization compared to the Soviet military might. But the introduction of the SAM was game-changing and ultimately led to, or was one of the very strong contributing factors to the Soviets leaving Afghanistan. Do you see something similar occurring with space, either from, to, or through, that will allow our non-friend, non-state actors, or even potentially state actors, to utilise those organisations and groups to sufficiently counter and challenge Western capability, a little bit like what you talked about with naval warships? They're not sunk and stopped, but they are sufficiently frozen and impaired in carrying out their mission. Do you see something like that happening, which we need to be alive to, or at least have the skills to anticipate?
So the very obvious one is SATCOM-enabled autonomous air systems, right? But I would say actually it's multi-domain, because we've seen a similar thing with USVs in the Black Sea and again in the Bab el-Mandeb. So that's very obvious because we're seeing it in today's conflict, right? So if I have a UAV and I place a warhead or something else on it, and I try to use that as a loitering munition or an FPV drone, that's going to last one iteration until it gets jammed, and then I'll have to update my software-defined radio and all my sensor systems to make that work. There's another way to do it, which is to have a fully autonomous system that's not communicating with the ground-based controller, but is talking to space systems, right? And that's, without getting into any detail on that, that's something that I think a lot of people are watching as it develops in Ukraine on both sides. And just the pace of evolution there is incredible. This is one of the things I write about in The Dragons and the Snakes. You don't get a steady growth of innovation where you get as innovation and adaptation spurts during wartime, and then those new ideas proliferate to new actors, and you get a sort of ecosystem of innovation that comes from warfare. And we're seeing now in Gaza and to a lesser extent in Lebanon and in Ukraine and in a couple of other places, we're seeing that impetus to innovation driving the evolution of autonomous systems. But autonomous systems that only need to check in occasionally with a space system and don't need to be driven by a human operator the whole time, and are able to then swarm in a way that's more difficult to disrupt. So that's the sort of non-state piece where I think we're going to see that. I mean, it's very hard to prevent an appropriately skilled non-state actor from acquiring those skills once they're out there. I mean, every time you shoot down, let's say you're a non-state actor fighting a government and the government's using UAVs against you, every time you shoot down one of them, or even every time one of them goes off, if you just recover the right electronic components and you have a very light ability to analyze those, now you can play that back at the adversary.
Yeah.
The other big one, which I think, again, people don't necessarily get the implications of this if they don't do what we do and spend all day thinking about it. But in 2021, the Chinese tested successfully a fractional orbital bombardment system using a hypersonic glide vehicle, which they re-entered actually over the southern pole and successfully demonstrated the ability to attack a moving target at sea from space, right? And what that essentially means is that all of our traditionally structured nuclear defenses globally, which are oriented over the northern hemisphere because all current nuclear powers are northern hemisphere powers, basically are in the wrong part of the globe, right? There's a whole bottom half of the globe that's not protected. So that means that new terrain, Southern Africa, very far south of Latin America, South Atlantic, Southern Indian Ocean, subantarctic possessions, they all start to become really important contested terrain in a way that they haven't been since 1945. So there's a huge range of things that non-state actors in the maritime domain and on land can do to advance the goals of a partner state in that environment. The other thing to note with all of that stuff is that we talk about littoral environments being the area where the operational effects of land, air, sea, space, and cyber all overlap. And traditionally that's been a band around the coast of a major piece of land. But that band's defined by technology. If you now have the ability to strike any spot on the planet from orbit, the whole planet is littoral. And for space people, we're now starting to think about what we would call a planetary littoral, right?
Yeah.
Where the terrestrial, Kármán line, orbital, cislunar space all start to interact. And I think that's going to be a really important driver of how governments operate, and that'll then also drive how non-state actors operate after that.
Yeah. It does feel like we're on a precipice of change. Like it's likely to maybe take us by surprise when it really happens and when it really occurs. And we talk very much about space being predominantly the supporting domain. Mm-hmm. And we have a space force now in the US, which is probably quite typical of Western ways of conducting warfare and managing human resources. We like to put it all into silos. Do you see merit in continuing that way, or do you think that we need to maybe reconsider how we blend our forces and our services? So space obviously having greater potential to become a supported domain in order to carry out littoral operations, work closely with ground units in different parts of the globe, but also having space professionals embedded as standard in larger volumes potentially within the other services, the more historic services of air, land and sea, to truly embed the thought process around that and how we can use space capability and how we can be influenced and affected by it. Like, is that something that we should be pushing harder to do?
I think it is, but I would go back to a historical analogy. So Billy Mitchell, one of the founders of air power in the US Army at the time, was like literally court-martialed in the 1920s for his advocacy for a single independent strategic air force that would not be tied to the interests of the Navy and the Army, but would actually operate as a third service. And we've had some similar kinds of, no one's been court-martialed, but we've had some similar dynamics here of having an independent space force, and obviously the AUKUS players all cut it slightly differently, but having something that's now mounting to a separate force. And then other services, particularly the air forces, saying, well, this is what we do. Good example would be space-based GMTI, right? Which was, GMTI has been an ground moving target indicator, so tracking assets on the ground has been an Air Force role forever. Yeah. And now there's a debate about whether should that be Air Force in space or should it be Space Force? And I think what we're going to, and I say this as just a basic infantry officer, I think we're going to end up in a similar place to where we ended up with air power, where we will have an independent strategic space force that does things to other space forces in the space domain, right? And projects power onto the planet and perhaps out, to the Lagrange points or something. That's doing stuff that's out there. But then you will have within each service a space component, much like Army, Navy, and Air Force have their own, sort of mini versions of each other. The US Navy has its own Air Force and its own Army, right?
Yep.
In the form of the Marine Corps. So I think you're going to get the emergence of like a cluster of different assets that includes terrestrially focused space capabilities that work with each of the traditional services, plus eventually, sooner rather than later actually, a strategic space force. So I saw Elon Musk was talking yesterday about, it's early September 2024, was talking about 4 years to an unmanned Mars mission and then 8 years to manned Mars missions, with 20 years being his target for having a full-on city in Mars. Whether you think that's true or not, or likely to happen or not, think about the implications for an independent space force of having an asset like a city on another planet, the geopolitics of that or the astropolitics of it, and how you're going to work that. This is coming quickly.
Yeah.
I just think we have to steal a term from your service, we have to think ahead of the jet, and not be like always catching up to where technology is, but conceptually project ourselves past where the space capability is today. That's hard to do.
Very.
Maybe easier for people that are less grounded in the current state of the race to be able to do it.
So our youth who are coming through, essentially the people who are beginning their military careers, as guardians, for example, they've known no other service, but maybe there's an opportunity with them to really think differently to perhaps the likes of you and I.
Right, and again, to use the analogy of air power in the 20th century, right up until the end of the Second World War, the vast majority of people that had, supreme command of air forces, even though they were independent air forces, had cut their teeth in the Fleet Air Arm or the Royal Flying Corps or the Army Air Corps, and had come from a single service background. From about 1950 onward, you start to see the emergence of these sort of born independent Air Force commanders who thought in a very different way, right? And I think we're on the cusp of that for sure, where people that have come up in the Space Force are going to think differently from people who were, seconded to the Space Force after a 10-year career in the Air Force, for example.
What advice would you offer to space professionals, regardless of their branch service or nationality? What would you offer to them?
Great question. And I'm probably not the best qualified to offer because I'm not a space person, but
maybe that's what they need.
Well, maybe. I mean, I think you touched on it earlier that sometimes space is the supported domain. Sometimes it's the supporting domain. And I think it's really important to understand which of those circumstances you're in, like who's supported, who's supporting, but also to recognize that in a dynamic, multi-domain competition environment that we're in now, that can turn really quickly, right? So even within a second or two, you might go from being you're trying to, jam somebody else's ability to monitor the space environment in order to get a physical asset into a piece of physical space to do a particular task. And then it might flip around on a dime and suddenly that asset that's now in position is there to achieve an effect that's going to enable you to do something in space. So I think we're going to start to see the need for that kind of thinking get more and more important. So I would argue you are in the Space Force for a reason, and it's to protect stuff on the planet right now. That'll change over time, right? But so really understand what other services expect from the Space Force and understand what you need to expect and how to communicate that. Then my only other thing would be, like, when you're at home on the weekend and you're talking to your aunt, or you're hanging out at the barbecue with, people that aren't in the military, try to communicate to them just how important space systems are for the modern way of life, because my experience is that a lot of people don't realize that.
Yeah.
And I think the more people recognize just how dependent we've become on like continuous to the second access to high fidelity space-based platforms, they're going to realize that, this isn't some like, why did we create a Space Force that's kind of ridiculous and, have comedians laughing at it, to go, oh no, actually, this is actually really important, and it's filling a gap that we allowed to emerge over 30 years without necessarily realizing it was there.
Yeah, we need it, and we need more.
We need more. We need guardians that can explain why we need it to people that aren't in the Space Force. And we need like I said, we probably need a strategic, independent Space Force to Space Force capability, but then also the components that work with each of the services. And all of that's part of that space capability ecosystem.
It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming over.
I could talk to you for hours, which I won't put you through. But no, thank you on behalf of all of our viewers as well, and on behalf of the National Security Space Institute here in Colorado.
Yeah, once again, thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
All right.